A cowboy stumbles upon three native women in the mud of a dry river, until one arm lifts. The cowboy had been riding since early morning, long before the sun climbed high enough to burn the land. His horse moved slowly, each step careful on the hard, cracked ground. The world around him looked tired and worn out, as if it had been holding its breath for too long. This land had once been alive with flowing water, green plants, and animal tracks. Now it felt empty. The river he followed was no longer a river at all. It was only a wide path of dried mud, broken into deep cracks that looked like scars across the earth. He was a man used to loneliness. Days like this were normal for him. Long rides, quiet thoughts, and the sound of wind brushing against dry grass were his daily companions. Still, something about this place felt heavier than usual. The silence was too deep, almost unnatural. Even birds were missing, and no insects buzzed in the heat. It felt like the land itself was warning anyone who passed through to be careful. The cowboy adjusted his hat to block the sun from his eyes. Sweat ran down his neck, soaking into his shirt. His water supply was low, but he believed he could reach a settlement before nightfall. Following the riverbed was usually the safest route. Even when water disappeared, people often traveled along these paths because they once led to life. But today, the riverbed felt more like a memory than a guide. As his horse walked along the dry mud, something ahead caught his attention. At first he thought it was just another strange shape formed by nature. The land often played tricks on tired eyes. Rocks could look like animals. Shadows could look like people. He squinted, slowing his horse, and leaned forward slightly. The shapes did not move, but they looked different from the rocks scattered around. Three dark forms lay ahead, stretched out across the mud. They were close together, almost as if they had fallen at the same time. The cowboy's heart beat a little faster. He had seen many things in his life: lost animals, broken wagons, and sometimes even bodies left behind by harsh weather. Still, he hoped he was wrong. He stopped his horse and listened. Nothing. No sound of breathing, no movement, no sign of life. Only the wind passed through the dry riverbed, carrying dust with it. For a moment, he considered riding away. This land was dangerous and stopping could bring trouble, but something held him there. A quiet voice inside him told him to look closer. He dismounted and led his horse forward slowly. With each step, the shapes became clearer. They were people. Three women lay in the mud, their bodies almost fully covered in dried clay and dirt. The sun had baked the mud so hard that it looked like stone. Their clothes blended into the earth, and their hair was stiff with dust. They looked as though the land itself had tried to pull them in. The cowboy removed his hat and held it against his chest. He felt a deep sadness rise inside him. He believed they were gone. Many travelers underestimated the land, especially during dry seasons. Heat, thirst, and exhaustion took lives quietly and without mercy. He had seen it before. He stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything. The women's faces were hard to see under the dirt, but he could tell they were native women by their features and clothing. His thoughts became heavy. He knew that their people often traveled long distances, relying on rivers that were no longer reliable. This dried riverbed might have betrayed them. He knelt down near the nearest woman, not touching her yet. The heat from the ground rose into his knees. He waited, watching for any sign, movement, breath, anything. Seconds passed, then minutes. Nothing changed. The silence pressed against his ears. The cowboy stood up slowly, his chest tight. He thought about riding to the nearest settlement to tell someone what he had found. But even as he turned slightly, ready to leave, something happened that froze him in place. One arm lifted. It was slow, weak, and unsteady, but it was real. The woman's arm broke free from the hardened mud and rose a few inches before falling back down. The movement sent a shock through the cowboy's body. His fear vanished in an instant, replaced by urgency and disbelief. They were alive. He rushed forward without thinking, kneeling beside her again. He spoke softly, his voice low and calm, though his heart raced. He didn't know if she could understand him, but he hoped the sound of a human voice would help. Her skin was hot and dry. Her breathing was shallow, almost too quiet to notice. He looked at the other two women. They were still, but now he knew better than to assume anything. He checked them carefully, watching their chests. Very slight movement told him they were alive too, though barely holding on. The cowboy swallowed hard. He was one man with limited supplies, standing in the middle of a lifeless riverbed with three people who needed help immediately. Panic tried to creep in, but he pushed it away. Panic would not save anyone. He reached for his water canteen. It was not full, and he knew he had to be careful. Too much water too fast could cause harm. He poured a small amount into his hand and gently touched it to the first woman's lips. She did not respond at first. He waited, then tried again. This time her lips moved slightly and a faint sound escaped her throat. Relief washed over him. It meant they still had a chance. The sun continued to beat down, reminding him that time was not on their side. He scanned the area, searching for any shade. The riverbed offered nothing, no trees, no rocks large enough to block the sun. He realized he would need to move them, but the hardened mud trapped their bodies like stone. Carefully, he began breaking the mud around their arms and shoulders using his hands and a small tool from his belt. He worked slowly, making sure not to hurt them. Sweat poured from his face, mixing with dust and mud. His hands shook from effort and stress, but he did not stop. As he worked, he wondered how long they had been there. Hours, a full day, maybe more. The dried river had likely once given them hope, just as it had given him direction. When the water disappeared, it must have trapped them in a place with no shelter and no escape. The cowboy felt anger toward the land, but he also understood it. Nature did not choose who it tested. It simply existed, unforgiving and silent. The first woman stirred again, her fingers twitching as more mud fell away. Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused and confused. She looked at him but did not speak. He offered her more water, just a few drops this time. She swallowed weakly. He moved to the second woman and repeated the process. Her breathing was shallow but steady. The third woman was the weakest of all. Her chest barely moved and her skin felt cooler than the others. Fear returned, stronger this time. He knew he needed help soon. As the sun moved higher, the cowboy realized this was only the beginning. Saving them would not be easy. Trust, strength, and time were all uncertain. But one thing was clear to him now. He could not leave them. Not after seeing that arm rise from the mud. Not after knowing life was still fighting beneath the earth. The dried riverbed, once a symbol of loss, had become the place where 3 lives were given another chance. And the cowboy, who had started the day expecting nothing more than a long, lonely ride, now stood at the edge of a story far bigger than himself. The cowboy worked without stopping, even as the sun burned higher in the sky. His shirt clung to his back, heavy with sweat and dust. Each breath felt dry, but he pushed his own discomfort aside. The 3 women needed him more than he needed rest. He reminded himself to stay calm, because calm hands saved lives. He continued breaking the hardened mud around their bodies, little by little. The mud had dried so tightly that it held them like a shell. He used his fingers first, then a small knife to loosen the cracks. He was careful not to cut skin. Every movement was slow and measured. The women were too weak to move on their own, and even a small mistake could cause pain. As more mud fell away, he could finally see their arms and shoulders clearly. Their skin was pale under the dirt, stretched tight from heat and thirst. Their lips were cracked, and their breathing was uneven. The cowboy spoke to them softly, even though they did not answer. He believed that hearing a human voice could still reach them somewhere inside. He knew he had to get them out of the open sun. The riverbed offered no shelter, but he spotted a small rise of land nearby where the ground dipped slightly. It was not much, but it could give some protection from the wind and heat. He decided that once their upper bodies were free, He would try to move them one at a time. The first woman stirred again. Her eyes opened longer this time, though they were still unfocused. She made a weak sound, almost like a question. The cowboy nodded gently, as if she could understand. He reassured her in a calm voice, telling her she was not alone. He gave her a few more drops of water, careful not to rush. The second woman shifted slightly as well. Her fingers curled, then relaxed. It was a small movement, but it gave him hope. The third woman remained still, and that worried him deeply. He checked her breathing again, placing his ear near her chest. It was there, but faint. He knew she was the closest to danger. The cowboy paused for a moment, wiping his face with his sleeve. He thought about his limited supplies. He had water, but not much. He had food, but it would not help them yet. What he needed most was help from others, but the nearest settlement was still far away. Leaving them alone was not an option. He decided he would do as much as he could before writing for help. First, he had to free them enough to move them into shade and keep them stable. He focused on the first woman again, breaking more mud around her torso. As the hard shell loosened, her body relaxed slightly, as if it had been held tight for too long. She took a deeper breath, then coughed weakly. The sound startled him, but it was a good sign. It meant her body was waking up. He supported her head gently and spoke again, slow and steady. He did not ask questions. He knew she had no strength to answer. Instead, he told her what he was doing, explaining each step as if that could guide her through the fear and confusion. Once her upper body was free, he slid his arm behind her shoulders and slowly lifted her. She was much lighter than he expected, her weight reduced by hunger and thirst. He carried her carefully to the shaded dip in the ground and laid her down on his rolled-up coat. He positioned her on her side, just as he had been taught long ago, so she could breathe more easily. He returned quickly to the riverbed for the second woman. His movements were faster now, driven by urgency. The sun was unforgiving and every minute mattered. He repeated the process, breaking the mud, speaking softly, offering water. She did not open her eyes, but her breathing became steadier as more of her body was freed. Carrying her was harder. His muscles burned and his legs trembled, but he did not stop. He brought her to the shaded spot and placed her beside the first woman, leaving space between them so they could breathe freely. Now only the third woman remained. The cowboy knelt beside her, his heart heavy. He spoke her name even though he did not know it. He called her sister, hoping the word would carry comfort. He checked her pulse again. It was weak, but it was there. That was enough to keep him going. The mud around her was thicker, as if she had sunk deeper into the riverbed. He worked carefully, sweat dripping onto the ground. His hands ached and his fingers were sore, but slowly the mud gave way. As he freed her shoulders, she did not move. Fear tightened in his chest. He placed a small amount of water on her lips. At first, nothing happened. Then, barely noticeable, her lips parted. A small swallow followed. The cowboy closed his eyes briefly in relief. He continued, one drop at a time. When he finally lifted her, her body felt fragile, like it could break under too much pressure. He held her close, steadying his breath, and carried her to the shade. He placed her gently beside the others and adjusted his coat to give them more cover from the sun. The three women now lay together, alive but weak. The cowboy sat back on his heels, breathing hard. For the first time since finding them, he allowed himself a moment to feel the weight of what had happened. Fear, relief, and responsibility all mixed together. He knew this was only a temporary solution. They needed proper care, more water, and rest in a safer place. He needed help, and soon. The first woman opened her eyes again. This time they stayed open. She looked around slowly, her gaze stopping on the cowboy. Confusion filled her expression, but there was also awareness. She tried to speak, but only a weak sound came out. He placed a finger gently to his lips, signaling her to rest. He pointed to the shade, then to his horse in the distance, hoping she understood that help was coming. She blinked slowly, as if trying to follow his meaning. The second woman stirred next, turning her head slightly. The third remained still, but her breathing had improved. The cowboy stayed close, watching them carefully. He adjusted their positions, making sure they were comfortable and safe. As the heat pressed down, he made a decision. He would ride to the settlement as fast as possible and bring back help, but leaving them alone, even for a short time, frightened him. He looked around, searching for any sign of danger. The land was quiet, empty, and still. He secured his water canteen near them, placing it where they could reach it if they gained strength. He spoke gently, explaining that he would return. He did not know if they fully understood, but he hoped they felt his intention. Before leaving, he stood for a moment, looking at them lying together in the shade. They had survived something terrible. The land had nearly taken their lives, but they were still here. The cowboy mounted his horse, his body tired but his purpose clear. As he turned back one last time, he saw the first woman watching him. Their eyes met. In that quiet moment, without words, trust was formed. He urged his horse forward, riding hard toward help, carrying with him the hope that he was not too late and the promise that he would return. The cowboy rode hard across the dry land, urging his horse forward with gentle pressure rather than panic. He knew that fear could make mistakes happen, and mistakes could cost lives. The sun was still high, and the heat followed him like a weight on his shoulders. Dust rose with every step the horse took, but he did not slow down. His thoughts stayed behind in the riverbed with the three women lying in the shade. He kept seeing the way one of them had looked at him, eyes tired but aware. That look stayed with him, pushing him forward. He promised himself he would come back with help. He had to. The land stretched wide and empty. The path toward the settlement was familiar, but today it felt longer than ever. His water was low, but he gave his horse small amounts when needed. He spoke softly to the animal, thanking it, encouraging it, reminding it that they were doing something important together. As he rode, memories came to him. He remembered stories he had heard growing up about travelers lost to heat and thirst. He remembered seeing wagons abandoned when people could not go on. He had always believed he understood how dangerous the land could be, but this day had shown him that danger could appear suddenly, without warning. After what felt like hours, he finally saw signs of life. Smoke rose faintly in the distance. The settlement was near. Relief filled his chest, but he did not slow down until he reached the first building at the edge of town. He rode straight into the open area, calling out for help before he even dismounted. People turned to look at him, surprised by his urgency. He slid off his horse and explained quickly, his words simple and clear. Three women trapped in a dried riverbed, weak from thirst, alive but in danger. The people did not waste time. They had seen hardship before. A few men gathered supplies, water, blankets, and simple medical tools. Someone brought a wagon, pulled by two strong horses. Others prepared shade coverings. The cowboy answered questions as best he could, giving directions and explaining their condition. Within minutes, they were moving. The wagon followed the path back toward the riverbed, faster than the cowboy had ridden alone. Dust filled the air, but no one complained. The mood was serious and focused. Everyone understood the urgency. The cowboy rode beside the wagon, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His heart beat fast with both hope and fear. He worried about what they might find when they returned. Had the shade been enough? Had the women stayed stable? He pushed those thoughts away and focused on getting there. When the dried riverbed came into view, he felt his breath catch. He scanned the shaded dip in the land immediately. The shapes were still there. Relief washed over him so strongly that his legs felt weak. The wagon stopped and people climbed down quickly. They approached the women carefully, speaking softly. One of the helpers knelt beside the first woman and checked her breathing. Another checked the second. The third woman was examined last, and concern crossed the helper's face, but they nodded. She was still alive. The women were given small amounts of water using cloths, their lips gently moistened. Blankets were placed beneath and over them to protect their skin from the heat and rough ground. The helpers worked together, calm and steady, just as the cowboy had hoped. The first woman opened her eyes again as the others arrived. She looked around, confusion clear on her face. The cowboy stepped closer, staying within her sight. He spoke her softly again, telling her help had come. She blinked and let out a weak breath as if some of the fear had finally left her. The women were carefully lifted onto the wagon, one by one. Every movement was slow and thoughtful. The helpers spoke quietly, reassuring them even if they could not fully understand. The cowboy stayed close, offering support where needed. Once all three were settled, the wagon began its return to the settlement. The ride was slow to avoid causing harm. The cowboy walked beside it for a while, watching their faces, making sure they were still breathing evenly. As they traveled, the second woman stirred and made a soft sound. It was the first sign that she was becoming more aware. One of the helpers leaned closer, offering comfort. The third woman remained quiet, but her breathing had become more regular. The journey felt long, but no one complained. When the settlement finally came into view again, the sun was lower in the sky. The heat was easing, though the day had taken its toll on everyone. The women were taken into a shaded building where they could rest. More water was prepared and cool cloths were placed on their foreheads. The cowboy stood back for a moment, watching as others took over. His role had changed now. He had brought them here. The rest was no longer in his hands alone. He sat down outside, leaning against the wall, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His hands were sore, his throat dry, and his body tired in a deep, heavy way. Still, inside him, there was a quiet sense of relief. He had done what he could. After some time, one of the helpers came out and spoke to him. The women were stable, weak but recovering. They would need rest and care, but they had survived the worst of it. The words felt like a gift. The cowboy nodded, unable to say much. As evening approached, the sky softened in color. The harsh light of day faded into warm tones. The land looked gentler now, though the cowboy knew that was only an illusion. The same land that nearly took 3 lives could look peaceful one moment and cruel the next. Later, the first woman asked for him. The helper told him quietly and led him inside. He approached slowly, unsure of what to expect. She lay resting, her face cleaner now, the mud washed away. Her eyes followed him as he entered. She spoke a few words in a weak voice, words he did not fully understand. Still, the meaning was clear: gratitude, recognition. He nodded respectfully, placing his hand over his chest. He told her he was glad she was safe. The second woman was awake too, watching quietly. The third slept, her chest rising and falling steadily. Seeing her breathe calmly eased the last of his fear. The cowboy did not stay long. He did not want to disturb their rest. Before leaving, he looked at them one last time, feeling a deep respect for their strength. They had endured something terrible and survived. As night settled in, the cowboy stepped outside. The stars began to appear, bright and clear. He looked up at them, thinking about how close life and loss could be. One moment the land had nearly claimed 3 lives. The next they were safe. He prepared to rest, knowing the next day would bring its own challenges. But for now, there was peace. The kind that comes only after a hard fight has been won, even if the marks of that fight remain. Far from the dried riverbed, the mud lay silent again, but it no longer felt like a place of death. It had become part of a story of survival, a reminder that even in the harshest places, life could still find a way to rise. The next morning arrived slowly, with a soft light spreading over the settlement. The heat had not yet returned, and the air felt calm and cool. The cowboy woke early, his body still sore from the long day before. For a moment he lay still, listening to the quiet sounds around him. Then his thoughts returned to the 3 women. He rose and prepared himself, hoping for good news. When he stepped outside, people were already moving about. Some carried water, others prepared food. Life continued as it always did, even after moments of danger. One of the helpers noticed him and nodded. There was a gentle smile on their face, a sign that things were improving. The cowboy walked toward the building where the women were resting. He did not rush. He knew healing took time. Inside, the air was cooler. The women lay on simple bedding, shaded and protected. Clean cloths had replaced the dried mud, and their faces looked more peaceful now. The first woman was awake, sitting up slightly with support behind her back. Her eyes were clearer, though still tired. When she saw the cowboy, recognition appeared in her expression. She nodded slowly. He returned the gesture, careful to keep his movements calm and respectful. The second woman was also awake, sipping small amounts of water. Her hands shook slightly, but she was stronger than before. The third woman slept deeply. Her breathing was steady, slow, and even. That alone felt like a victory. A helper explained quietly that the women had been traveling together, following the riverbed because it once led to safe paths. The drought had been worse than expected. The river had dried faster than usual, and the heat had trapped them before they could turn back. They had tried to wait for cooler hours, but exhaustion had taken over. The cowboy listened without speaking. He had seen this story before in different forms. The land gave and the land took. People trusted it because they had no choice. Sometimes that trust was rewarded. Sometimes it was not. The first woman spoke again, slowly this time, using simple words mixed with gestures. She pointed toward the horizon, then down toward the ground. Her story came out piece by piece. They had rested in the riverbed, believing it would stay cooler. When the sun rose higher than expected, the mud softened beneath them. Weakness came quickly. Standing again became impossible. The cowboy felt a tightness in his chest. He imagined the fear of being trapped, the heat pressing down, the strength leaving their bodies little by little. He nodded gently, letting her know he understood. As the day passed, the women continued to recover. They were given small meals, easy to eat and digest. Water was given carefully, spaced out over time. Each hour brought small improvements. The second woman managed to sit up on her own. The third stirred more often, her fingers moving, her face relaxing. The cowboy stayed nearby, helping when asked, stepping back when not needed. He did not see himself as a hero. He had simply done what anyone should do when finding people in need. Still, he felt a quiet bond forming, built not on words but on shared experience. Outside, the settlement prepared to contact the women's community. Messengers were sent, carrying news of their survival. Everyone understood the importance of returning them safely to familiar faces once they were strong enough. In the afternoon, the heat returned, but the building remained cool. The cowboy stepped outside to tend to his horse, brushing dust from its coat and checking its legs. The animal had worked hard, and he made sure it was well cared for. As he worked, his thoughts wandered. He realized how close the line between life and loss truly was. If he had ridden a different path that day, if his eyes had missed those shapes in the mud, the story would have ended very differently. The thought stayed with him, heavy and humbling. When he returned inside, the third woman was awake. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the light. Confusion filled her face at first, then fear. One of the helpers spoke softly, reassuring her. The cowboy stayed back, giving her space. When her eyes finally settled on him, recognition came slowly, like a memory returning. Tears filled her eyes, though her body was too weak to react strongly. The cowboy lowered his head slightly, a sign of respect. He spoke quietly, telling her she was safe now. She closed her eyes again, exhausted but calmer. As evening approached, the women were able to sit together. They spoke softly among themselves, their voices weak but steady. Their connection was clear. They had survived together, and that bond was strong. The cowboy watched from a distance. He felt like an outsider in this moment, and he accepted that. This was their time, their story. He had only been a small part of it. One of the elders from the settlement came to speak with him later. They thanked him for his actions, not with grand words but with simple honesty. The cowboy accepted the thanks quietly. He did not feel proud in the way people often expected. Instead, he felt grateful that he had arrived in time. That night, the women's community arrived. They came with concern written on their faces, relief following close behind. When they saw the women alive, resting, and improving, emotions filled the room. Quiet tears, gentle touches, soft words of comfort. The cowboy stepped back again, allowing the reunion to happen without his presence. One of the elders approached him afterward. They spoke to him calmly, expressing gratitude in a way that carried deep meaning. The cowboy listened, his hat held respectfully in his hands. He nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. As the night grew deeper, the settlement became quieter. The women were surrounded by familiar voices now. Their recovery would continue among those who knew them best. The cowboy prepared to leave the next morning. His journey was not finished and the land still waited. Before dawn, he returned once more to the building. The first woman was awake. She looked at him, understanding clear in her eyes. She reached out and touched her chest, then gestured toward him. It was a simple gesture, but it carried gratitude, respect, and farewell. He returned the gesture, placing his hand over his own chest. He did not stay long. Long goodbyes were not his way. He mounted his horse and rode out as the sun began to rise, painting the land with soft light. As he left, the settlement slowly faded behind him. The land ahead was still dry, still harsh, still full of risk. But it also carried quiet reminders of what people could do for one another, even in the hardest places. The cowboy rode on, changed by what he had seen. He knew he would remember the dried riverbed, the lifted arm, and the strength of 3 women who refused to disappear into the earth. The land would continue to test those who crossed it. But sometimes, in the middle of that test, humanity would rise, just enough to tip the balance toward life. The cowboy rode away from the settlement just as the morning sun began to warm the land. The air was quiet, and the world felt calm after the long days of tension. His horse walked at a steady pace, and the sound of its hooves blended with the soft wind. Behind him, the settlement slowly disappeared, but the memory of what had happened stayed close to his heart. As he traveled, his thoughts returned again and again to the dried riverbed. He remembered the cracked mud, the still shapes, and that one small movement that changed everything. That lifted arm had been more than a sign of life. It had been a reminder that hope could appear in the most unlikely places. The land stretched wide and empty ahead of him. It looked the same as it always had, dry, silent, and demanding. But to the cowboy, it felt different now. He no longer saw it only as something to cross or survive. He saw it as a place that tested people, not to break them but to reveal who they truly were. He stopped near a small rise and let his horse rest. Sitting there, he drank a little water and looked out across the horizon. He thought about the 3 women, now safe among their people. He imagined them growing stronger each day, their bodies slowly recovering from the hardship they had faced. He hoped that, in time, the memory of the riverbed would fade, replaced by the comfort of familiar voices and places. The cowboy did not believe in fate the way some people did, but he believed in moments. He believed that small choices mattered, choosing to slow down, choosing to look closer, choosing to help instead of turning away. Those choices had shaped this story, just as they shaped many others across the land. As he continued his journey, he passed through familiar paths. He greeted other travelers, shared brief words, and moved on. Life went forward as it always did. Yet inside him, something had shifted. He found himself paying more attention to the land, to people, to signs that others might miss. Days later, he rode past another dried stream. He slowed his horse and studied the ground carefully. There were no signs of trouble here, but he stayed alert. He understood now how quickly a safe path could become dangerous. He made a quiet promise to himself to never ignore that feeling again, the one that told him to look closer. The story of the three women spread slowly. People spoke of it in low voices, sharing it as a lesson rather than a tale of excitement. They talked about how the land had nearly taken lives and how compassion had stepped in at the right moment. The cowboy never corrected the stories, even when details changed. He did not seek attention. What mattered to him was that the women lived. Weeks passed and the seasons began to shift. The heat softened slightly and clouds gathered more often in the sky. One evening, as the cowboy camped under the stars, rain finally came. It was light at first, then stronger. The smell of wet earth filled the air and the ground welcomed the water eagerly. He smiled quietly to himself. Somewhere that dried riverbed might begin to change. Cracks would soften. Mud would loosen. Maybe one day water would flow there again. The thought brought him peace. Far away, the three women continued their recovery. They returned to their daily lives slowly, carefully. The experience had left marks not just on their bodies but in their hearts. They spoke of the land with new respect and of the stranger who had stopped when others might have passed by. They did not remember every detail clearly. Pain and exhaustion had blurred much of it. But they remembered the calm voice, the careful hands, and the feeling of being seen when they thought all was lost. That memory stayed strong. The women shared their story with others, not as a tale of fear, but as one of survival and connection. They reminded their community of the importance of traveling together, of listening to the land, and of helping when help was needed. Their experience became part of the shared wisdom passed down through quiet conversations. The cowboy never returned to the dried riverbed. He did not feel the need to. That place had already given him its lesson. Instead, he carried it forward, letting it guide his actions in small, meaningful ways. Sometimes, at night, he would think about how close everything had come to ending differently. If he had ridden faster, if the sun had been hotter, if that arm had not lifted when it did, those thoughts made him grateful for the fragile balance that allowed life to continue. He understood now that heroism was not about grand actions or recognition. It was about being present when it mattered most. It was about seeing people not as strangers, but as fellow travelers facing the same unforgiving world. Years later, when the cowboy grew older, the land was still much the same. Rivers still dried. Heat still tested those who crossed it. But stories like this one continued to be told, quietly, from one person to another. Stories that reminded people to watch carefully, to act kindly, and to never assume that stillness meant the end. One evening, sitting by a small fire, the cowboy shared the story with a younger traveler. He spoke simply, without adding drama. He described the shapes in the mud, the lifted arm, and the long road to help. When he finished, the traveler sat quietly for a moment. "What made you stop?" the traveler finally asked. The cowboy thought about it. He looked into the fire, watching the flames move. "I don't know," he said. "Something told me to look again." That answer seemed enough. As the fire burned low, the cowboy felt content. He had lived many days, crossed many miles, and seen both loss and survival. But that single moment by the dried riverbed remained one of the clearest memories of his life. It reminded him that life often whispered before it shouted, that hope could be buried under mud and silence, and that sometimes all it took was one person choosing to notice. The land would always be harsh. The sun would always be strong. Rivers would come and go. But as long as people were willing to lift one another up when the ground tried to pull them down, there would always be stories like this one. And somewhere, long after the mud dried and cracked again, the memory of a lifted arm would continue to rise, quiet, powerful, and full of life.